Before turning our attention to the literary context of Isaiah, walking through an outline of the book and observing some of the literary features, let's turn our attention to Isaiah as an individual and look at what we might learn about him as a person. As far as his origin is concerned, most likely he harks from Jerusalem. Tradition suggests that he was actually related to King Uzziah. He evidently was well educated, and this is shown by his rhetorical skills preserved in his oracles. As concerns his call to ministry, chapter 6 gives a detailed description of an encounter he experienced with God in a visionary fashion, cast in the temple itself. He may have been engaged in ministry prior to this, as suggested by preceding oracle material in chapters 1 through 5, but in any case, this was likely very early in his ministry. In this encounter, he was particularly captured by the holiness of God, this aspect of God's character, and that in turn exposed his own sinfulness, which then led to cleansing, which in turn led to him being able to hear God musing to himself, expressing his need for someone to carry a divine message. Upon hearing that, Isaiah responded with an offer to help. He learned that this would be a difficult task because his audience would not be receptive. When we think about Isaiah's discovery that he had unclean lips there in the context of that call vision, it's interesting to realize that the angelic figures that appeared in the vision are described as seraphs, and this means the burning ones, just like the coal which they took from the altar, a burning fragment which was used to cleanse Isaiah's lips. I can't help but wonder that as Isaiah overheard the seraphs engaged in worship, praise of God, he felt like he was unable to join in that chorus because of his own impurity. He wanted to, but he was obstructed until the seraphs cleansed his lips. How important it would be to have clean lips if one is going to be an exponent, a loudspeaker, passing along a divine message. And this speaks to any of us who are involved in carrying a message from God to others. Next, let's think about Isaiah in relationship with the community where he lived. We know, for example, that he was married. His wife is designated as a prophetess, according to chapter 8, verse 3. He's like Hosea in that his children will have names that are symbolic. Shir Yashuv is the name of the elder one in chapter 7, verse 3. This has the meaning, a remnant will return. It was a word of encouragement to King Ahaz when he was under the pressure of the Syro-Ephraimite coalition along about 734 to 732. To hear these words from God's prophet, a remnant will return, would be a message to bolster his confidence. The second son was named Maher Shalal Hashbaz, quick to the plunder, swift to the spoil is the meaning of that name. This turns up in chapter 8, the early verses of chapter 8, and indicates that the threat of Assyria is genuine, and soon they will come and capture Samaria. Well, that again will take pressure off of the southern kingdom. So bad news for northern Israel, but good news for southern Israel. By studying the time frames of ministry for Amos, Hosea, and Micah, we can tell that these would have overlapped, even though there's no mention of these three in Isaiah itself. In addition, as you can see on the screen, we learn from 2 Chronicles 26 that Isaiah served as a chronicler for the reign of Uzziah and also for Hezekiah. Notice this parallel of the description of the siege of Jerusalem. On the left, you'll see a passage from 2 Kings 19, And on the right, a passage from Isaiah 37. Take a moment and begin to read to yourself, comparing across the vertical boundary. It's quite similar, isn't it? You get the feeling that whoever wrote 2 Kings had access to Isaiah, or perhaps one direction or another, there's some sharing of material. Another dimension that's interesting to explore has to do with what kind of response did the prophet encounter when he put out his message. On the one hand, we find some of his audience responding with relief, and here we're thinking particularly of the monarchy. When Ahaz heard messages of encouragement coming from Isaiah chapter 7, Syro-Ephraimite coalition breathing down his neck, this must have been a message that would give him great relief. Hezekiah hears the message in chapters 38 and 39 that although there will be some negative experiences suffered by the southern kingdom, he finds out that it won't happen during his lifetime, and he is glad for the message brought by the prophet. That's kind of a mixed bag. It's like the boom will fall, but I'll be out of the way, so I'm relieved to miss it. Not all responses were favorable, however. Chapter 30, verse 9 reads, "This is a rebellious people, false sons who refuse to listen, who say to the seers," and that was an old term describing the role of the prophet, and notice what the people in this era, some of them at least, were saying. Quote, "You must not see visions." And to the prophets, "You must not prophesy to us what is right." Notice what they ask for instead. Prophesy illusions. Let us hear no more about the Holy One of Israel. From chapter 30, verses 9 through 11. This is a powerful indictment of at least one sector of the population, which was saying, you come to us as an authorized prophet, we are not interested unless you tell us sweet sayings, unless you make the picture rosy. Don't give us any confrontation, no reprimand. We're not interested in that. If that's in your portfolio, just go somewhere else. It's a severe, severe indictment. We learn also that there were in leadership positions in that culture some individuals in spiritual roles which were false individuals, whether it be prophets or priests. Listen to this from chapter 28. "These also stagger from wine and reel from beer. Priests and prophets stagger from beer and are befuddled with wine. They reel from beer. They stagger when seeing visions. They stumble when rendering decisions. All the tables are covered with vomit. There is not a spot without filth." So we discover that there were people in the culture occupying respected roles who were just terribly misusing their roles, even to the extent of inebriation. I trust you might have picked up even the beauty, the care with which that terrible scene is described. Beauty in terms of the literary composition. They stagger from wine, reel from beer. Priests stagger from beer, befuddled with wine. There's a cadence to it. It's even the composition has a feel of staggering. It's beautifully, it's powerfully designed to express a very, very sober message. Another dimension that catches my interest is to ask, to what degree does the prophet seem to be involved in the message? Is he simply passing it along with no sense of pathos, without feeling what will be the price of this message to the people who receive it? Or on the other hand, does he seem to be integrated with it? Is it part of his own person? Notice from these excerpts how Isaiah is involved with his message. From chapter 16, verse 11, he writes, and this is an oracle for a nation outside of Israel. Moab. He says, my heart laments for Moab. There's empathy for this nation outside of Israel. The next comes from an oracle against Babylon, Isaiah 21, beginning with verse 3. And here's a nation that is far removed from Israel, and at times has been a fairly powerful player in the international scene. They are not so strong right now, although they will gain strength in the years to come. Isaiah declares, at this, and he's referring to the news of attack against Babylon, at this my body is racked with pain. Pangs seize me. Staggered, bewildered, my heart falters. The twilight I longed for has become a horror to me. So again, just as with Moab, there's a strong degree of empathy towards non-Israelites who are experiencing judgment. And this last one, from chapter 22, verse 4, describes how he responds at the news of Jerusalem experiencing judgment. Turn away from me, let me weep bitterly. Do not try to console me over the destruction of my people. Isn't that graphic? Can you picture someone, you approach them to comfort, to put an arm around their shoulder, to listen as they weep. This person is so distraught. He says to you, go away. There is no comfort for me. I must taste this bitterness. I must be in isolation. Just let me cry. Leave me alone. So we sense from these little excerpts that Isaiah was someone involved in his message. He was not simply, as we saw in the case of Jonah, positioned on a hill, just waiting expectantly and hopefully for God's judgment to descend on a nation such as the Assyrians and a capital such as Nineveh. Instead, Isaiah depicts an empathetic response towards people who will be experiencing suffering. Finally, the death of Isaiah. Now, this is not described in canonical scriptures, but according to tradition, we have the suggestion that Isaiah suffered martyrdom by being sawn in two. And this derives from a writing known as the Assumption of Isaiah. We can't help but think that perhaps this underlies the mention in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 37, a mention that some martyrs were sawn in two. The writer of Hebrews may have been thinking of this evident death of Isaiah through martyrdom. Now let's consider how it was that Isaiah got his message across. It's interesting in the case of each prophet to watch how they communicated the themes, the oracles that God delivered to them. Sometimes it seems to be a straightforward preaching. Other times there are other avenues employed by the prophet. Proclamation seems to be clearly the leading mode employed by Isaiah. We have a lot of oracles which have no trimmings around them, no description of symbolic sermons. He's simply declaring the message. His children had symbolic names, as we mentioned earlier, similar to the prophet Hosea. So this was an attention-getting device. I can imagine them walking through a marketplace and someone greeting the prophet, asking what are the names of his children, perhaps, and upon learning of them, wondering, well, I have never seen any kids named going by those names, so what's going on? Isaiah, why did you name them? So that would have been an occasion for explaining God's message. The use of drama. In chapter 20, we find the account that Isaiah went stripped and barefoot for one particular portion of oracle. Jeremiah will use many more dramatic sermons, but at least we have one sample of this in Isaiah's ministry. And then writing. We're not referring to any particular portions of Isaiah where it says Isaiah took a pen and wrote things down, or he had a scribe, such as Jeremiah will have, a scribe, Baruch, who wrote things down for Jeremiah. But rather we're just recalling that for the reign of Uzziah and also the reign of Hezekiah, there's mention in Chronicles of Isaiah serving as something in the order of a court historian or a chronicler. Now let's examine briefly an outline of this enormous book. We have 66 chapters to work with. We'll examine the outline first in brief form and then a slightly fuller one. Old Testament Survey uses an outline largely of this sort to give major headings. The first 35 chapters, judgment with promise. So there are words of reproof, reprimand, but also some hope. Then in chapters 36 through 39, a historical interlude. This is the place in Isaiah where he retells Sennacherib's invasion, also the illness of Hezekiah, and the envoys from Babylon, from the king Merodach-Baladan. In this section there is not nearly as much oracular material. It reads a great deal like a section out of Kings or Chronicles. Here's another outline that still is at the chapter level but gives us a bit more detail, and this comes from Hassel Bullock. The first 12 chapters, oracles of judgment and hope, and then notice at chapter 13 there's a distinct segment that addresses nations outside Israel. Then follow in 24 through 27, eschatological summation, not directed towards a single nation, but indicating that God will rule globally. 28 through 33 refer to Jerusalem in some passages and to Egypt in other passages. 34 and 5 bring another sort of eschatological summation, indicating that God at the end of time will wind up in complete control exerted or in a global extent. 36 through 39 is like the historical interlude that showed up in the previous outline, same material. And then chapters 40 through 66, oracles of consolation. Isaiah is a rich book, and it might be interesting or helpful if we just listened to a sequence of famous lines. I suspect that many of these may be familiar to you. You will recognize some of them as coming from famous oratorios, others favorite verses perhaps for yourself or friends who have influenced you. I'll just briefly read the site and then a phrase, an excerpt from it. Chapter 1, verse 18. Though your sins are like scarlet, they shall be white as snow. 5:20. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil. 6:3. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of His glory. And then from chapter 11, verse 6, and also 65:25. The wolf will live with the lamb. 29:13. This people come near me with their mouth and honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. 30:15. In returning and rest is your salvation. In quietness and trust is your strength. But you would have none of it. 30:18. The Lord longs to be gracious to you. 32, verse 2. Streams in the desert. 34:4. All the stars of the heavens will be dissolved, and the sky rolled up like a scroll. 35:8. A highway will be there, the way of holiness. The next cluster all come from chapter 40. Verse 1. Comfort, comfort my people. Verse 4. Every valley shall be raised up, every mountain and hill made low. Verse 8. The grass withers and the flowers fall, but the word of our God stands forever. Verse 11. He gathers the lambs in His arms. And finally, chapter 40, verse 31. Those who hope or wait on the Lord will renew their strength. 42 verse 3. A bruised reed he will not break. You may recall that one used in reference to Jesus. Chapter 43 verse 2. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. 43 verse 19. Look, I am doing a new thing, away in the desert. 46:4. I have carried you since your birth. 48:11. I will not yield my glory to another. 48:18. Your peace would have been like a river. 48:22. There is no peace, says the Lord, for the wicked. 49:16. See, I have engraved you on the palms of my hands. 49:23. Those who hope in me will not be disappointed. 50 verse 9. It is the sovereign Lord who helps me. Who will condemn me? 51:11. The ransomed or redeemed of the Lord will return with singing. 52:7. How beautiful on the mountains are the feet of those who bring good news, who proclaim peace. 55:1. Come, all you who are thirsty, come to the waters, buy and eat. 55:6 and 7. Seek the Lord while he may be found. He will freely pardon. 55:8. My thoughts are not your thoughts. 55:10 and 11. As the rain, so my word will not return to me empty. 55:12. You will go out in joy and be led forth in peace. 57:15. I live in a high and holy place, but also with the one who is contrite. 58:6. Is not this the kind of fasting that I have chosen? 58:13. Call the Sabbath a delight. 59:2. Your iniquities have separated you from your God. 59:17. He put on righteousness as his breastplate. 60 verse 1. Arise, shine, for your light has come. 60:19 and 20. The sun will no more be your light by day, nor will the brightness of the moon shine on you. For the Lord will be your everlasting light, and your God will be your glory. The Lord will be your everlasting light. 64:1. Oh, that you would rend the heavens and come down. 64:4. You act on behalf of those who wait for you. 64:6. All our righteous acts are like filthy rags. Like the wind, our sins sweep us away. 64:8. We are the clay, you are the potter. 65:17 and 19. Behold, I will create new heavens and a new earth. The sound of weeping and of crying will be heard in Jerusalem no more. 66:19. They will proclaim my glory among the nations. That was a large collection of famous lines, wasn't it? And yet I hope as those coursed by, you might have recognized a number of them and realized through this composite impact that Isaiah is indeed a magisterial book. Let's turn our attention now to the literary context. For the most part, we will find that the book of Isaiah is expressed poetically, so similar with most of the prophetic oracles. And yet there are some significant sections of narrative, and here we're thinking of his call in chapter 6, the encounter with King Ahaz, reassuring him in chapter 7, and then chapters 36 through 39, presenting the account of Sennacherib's invasion and also the envoys from Babylon. The quality of poetry in Isaiah has long been recognized to be very sophisticated. And I must admit, although I had been aware of that, it was not until I began to read through it in Hebrew that I realized what other scholars have been saying. There is more, in a sense, there's more literary refinement per square inch, per chapter, than I have seen in other portions that I've read in Hebrew. So I commend it to you. We'll endeavor to show a few samples of that in the next few minutes. Here is one sample among many of wordplay. It comes from chapter 7, verse 9, particularly the last half, where the oracle declares, and here is a word to King Ahaz, who is encouraged to be confident in God's rescue of the southern kingdom in the face of the Syro-Ephraimite pressure. If you do not stand firm, you will not stand at all. And what's going on there, in the expression standing firm, the concept there is standing firm in your faith or your confidence in God. That uses a word which is very similar to the expression at the end, standing at all. Both of those come from the Hebrew verb aman. The first one uses the hiphial stem, and the second uses the nephal stem. So there's a slight change. Let me pronounce them for you. The first, standing firm, is expressed ta'aminu, and the second, te'amenu. Ta'aminu, te'amenu. A lot of similarity, and naturally these come from the same root word, but the refinement used by Isaiah to turn the message just by a slight change in the verbal stem is very sophisticated. Understanding this passage as irony has the following effect. When God instructs Isaiah, make the heart of this people calloused, I believe what he's saying is, Isaiah, I have a difficult task for you because the message which you are going to give very often will be resisted. It will be as if you are investing your efforts just to make the people hard-hearted against you. That's not my intent, but all too often that will be the effect. Lest they should see, they should hear, they should understand, and turn and be healed. It will be as if, God is saying, it will be as if my ministry through you is calculated to make it impossible for them to turn to me. But once again, I would appeal to the broader witness of Scripture, which reveals the character of God as routinely interested in just the opposite, going to extreme lengths to give people a second, a third, a fourth chance, so that at the 11th hour they would turn from wickedness, repent. Consequently, I find it rather difficult to take this as a straightforward message, but seen as irony, it's a very poignant message, fortifying Isaiah against a difficult task, even though the negative outcome is not what God ultimately wishes for. It sometimes will be the outcome that the people desire, turning against God despite being warned by the prophet. Metaphor. Here are some samples of Isaiah's use of metaphor. From chapter 1, verse 21, he declares, "See how the faithful city has become a harlot." Notice the description of the city, faithful. In a marital context, that is a rich description. And notice how she instead is described, a harlot. This is one who, in a marital relationship, has thrown away faithfulness. The metaphor is very, very powerful. Same chapter 1, verse 22. Your silver has become dross. Again, the use of metaphor. And it continues, your choice wine is diluted with water. The implication seems to mean stretched due to poverty or deception, and frankly losing all of its rich flavor. And finally, this sample from chapter 29, verse 4. See if you can imagine this. Picture it in your mind as the words course by. Brought low, you will speak from the ground. Your speech will mumble out of the dust. Your voice will come ghost-like from the earth. out of the dust your speech will whisper. Very picturesque language, using metaphor throughout to cast an image that the demise of the people will reduce them to a mere vapor, as if a ghost, with no shred left of potency or power. Next, let's look at an example of simile. In chapter 30, verses 13 to 14, we have a simple but very beautiful example of Isaiah's use of this basic literary device. We'll be looking particularly at the reference to city walls and potsherds, broken pieces of pottery. Therefore this iniquity shall become for you like a break in a high wall. There's our first simile. Bulging out and about to collapse, whose crash comes suddenly in an instant. We'll pick up with the rest of this selection a little bit later. To get an idea of what walls were like in the ancient world, here's first of all a picture of the entry gates at the ancient city of Megiddo. Megiddo is located far to the north of Jerusalem, heading towards the coast, overlooking the Jezreel Valley. To appreciate an archaeological site like this today, it's helpful to be aware that the thin layer of rocks that are shown along the cyan line, that thin layer represents the top of the walls as the archaeologists found them when they excavated. The rest of the rock would be pieces found on the site that were not in position, so they've extrapolated from the lower layer and then built it on up. Megiddo is an ancient city, actually dating to pre-Israel times, and you can see it located, the red dot here, overlooking the Jezreel Valley. It was significant during Israel as well, as a fortification, as a battle site. What we want to take away from this is an appreciation of how fundamental is the importance of a wall for defensive purposes in the ancient world. Now we'll turn our attention to an actual wall that was excavated dating back to the time of Hezekiah. This segment will give you an aerial view of Hezekiah's wall, the portion which he built in anticipation of a siege, which actually took place then under Sennacherib, the Assyrian, in 701 BC. We'll raise the angle of the camera initially in order to get our bearings. Here's the Dead Sea. The Jordan River would be flowing into it from the lower left corner. So lower left is north, upper right is south. Here's the barren area descending down to the Jordan Rift Valley. And now the gray area that's directly beneath us is modern-day Jerusalem. Off on the left you see the Dome of the Rock that orients us to the Temple Mount. Let me back out just a bit. The uninhabited area, the gray-green area where the cursor is right now, that's the Kidron Valley. Mount of Olives would be over the green orchard area there off to the left. And then the uninhabited area with the darker green in the upper right, that's the Hinnom Valley. Here you see the old wall of the medieval city, Temple Mount. This portion right here where the cursor is, that's the western wall, formerly known as the Wailing Wall, a very special place of prayer for Jewish people today. And we're interested in this region right here with the red dot in it. This is the wall of Hezekiah, known as the Broad Wall. It's been excavated, and they discovered what we're interested in is the pavement that I'm outlining right here. This pavement. You're not so interested in the outer wall, that's simply the excavation wall, but rather this line right here marks a raised portion of what looks like pavement. Actually, it's the lower portion of a wall. A photograph in just a bit will show that a little more clearly. Also in the photograph, you'll notice a signboard that's posted. And just in terms of orientation, the signboard is located on this excavation wall. The position of the photographer would be roughly up in this area, looking in this direction. There'll be another signboard that we'll notice that's posted on the excavation wall over here, giving the elevation of the expected elevation of the original wall. The signboard here will give us a map of Old Jerusalem. We're now in Jerusalem, examining the excavation portion of a site that has revealed the lower layers of a wall built during Hezekiah's time. Here's the angle of the wall itself. Archaeologists point out to us that the material this wall is made of is not standard wall-making stone. Compare it to the massive and finely trimmed stones that we saw at Megiddo. That would be a standard outer wall. This is rather a hastily built wall. In fact, the stones would have come from houses that were demolished, and we find that very fact recorded in the Bible. The next slide will turn our attention to this portion, which will give us a map and also a label that will orient us to where this fragment of the wall was located in the overall scheme for Hezekiah. So we know that this wall dates to Jerusalem in the First Temple period. That would be the Solomonic Temple, dating as far back as roughly 1000 BC, perhaps 950 when Solomon built the temple. Obviously the time frame of Hezekiah is later, and this portion of the wall would have been built in Hezekiah's period. Now let's swing to the left and take a look at the map that was that's portrayed there. We're looking down on ancient Jerusalem in map fashion. East is to the top. You see the figure in the lower left indicating north, heading off to the left. The Kidron Valley is running from the left to the right in a north-south fashion, just on the far side of the city. The Hinnom Valley is running top to bottom in an east-west orientation on the south side of the old city. The Temple Mount is located then just overlooking the Kidron Valley. The Dome of the Rock is located roughly where that golden disc is. Our interest is this small brownish angular line in the cyan circle. The black dot is roughly where the photographer was standing and taking the previous picture. And this is Hezekiah's new wall. It was an internal wall, not the first defensive wall. There would have already been a city wall in place. Hezekiah was concerned about Sennacherib's invasion, and so he built a secondary defense inside the old wall. You can see it a little more clearly from this picture. Back to the excavation site, off to the right from where we were standing, we find this measuring device. And you can see there at the top, they're indicating this is where they estimate the top of the wall would have reached. Isaiah in chapter 22 makes this statement. On that day you looked to the weapons of the house of the forest, and you saw that there were many breaches in the city of David. So this is an assessment of defenses, realizing that there are some places where the enemy could poke through and pour into the city. Going on, and you collected the waters of the lower pool. We'll come back to this feature later in this lecture. Notice the next statement. You counted the houses of Jerusalem, and you broke down the houses to fortify the wall. That's what archaeologists have verified as far as the composition of this portion, or this secondary wall. It's not made of standard wall making or wall supply stones that have been properly quarried. It's rather a hastily constructed wall made out of inferior stone. Continuing on, you made a reservoir between the two walls, so an outer wall and inner wall, for the water of the old pool, but you did not look to him who did it, or have regard for him who planned it long ago. We want to focus then on this image that Isaiah uses now in chapter 30, where he's describing what is the effect of sin. If people embrace it and do not turn away, it becomes like this, and here's the simile, a break in a high wall. And what it does is it bulges out, and then it collapses, crashing down in an instant. Devastating effect. What should have been a source of great security, a city wall, defensive structure, winds up being an enormous liability, a life-threatening hazard. Just the opposite. So this simile also involves a reversal. We're still in Jerusalem, but we're going to leave Hezekiah's wall and look at structures around the Temple Mount. As we do this, we are changing time frame. We're updating it to the time of Herod the Great. We'll first look at the Western Wall, formerly known as the Wailing Wall, and then turn our attention to the southwest corner that you see depicted here. Here's that Western Wall, formerly known as the Wailing Wall. This is not so much a defensive wall, but it gives us an example of how substantial was the architecture of walls in the ancient world. In the case of this particular wall, it did not serve a defensive purpose, but rather was a soil retention wall. He built this large wall in order to fill with dirt and make a large plaza instead of the sloped hill zone. Our attention next will go to the right, heading south to the corner of this rectangular wall structure. Now you see that corner on the far left, and in a moment a photograph will take the view looking far up to get an appreciation of how large is this earth retention wall. While we're at it, please take note that the dark blue arrow line is indicating one single stone. These are just absolutely breathtaking in dimension. So here we have that same corner, and you can see how far it reaches up to the level of Herod's construction program. The bored hole in the lower right is circled just as a point of orientation for future photographs. Here you see that same hole there on the right. What interests us here is the pavement. Notice how undulating this pavement is. When I first saw this, I supposed there might have been an earthquake, but our tour guide said no, this is not the result of any kind of geologic disturbance. Looking off to the left, that same zone, notice the depression in the ancient pavement. Incidentally, we were told that the protrusions, the remainders of wall, partition walls that come out, would have divided various shop stalls along the outer perimeter of the Temple Mount. So people selling wares to travelers who would be coming in for celebrations, for festivals, for worship. Just imagine this whole series of stalls along this pavement. Once again, the orientation point there with that bored hole, and focus on that upper corner, because in the next slide we'll see a piece of the stonework which is actually like the corner, almost the railing or the capping of the ledge up there on the southwestern corner. This large piece, damaged as it is, you can see that it has a right angle structure to it. That was previously up top at the corner. The far left end of it, over in this area, notice that there's an inscription. We're going to close in on that in just a moment. While this particular piece is a replacement, it's only a replacement because the original piece with the inscription has been moved to a museum. This inscription reads, Levet ha-Tekiah. Tekiah refers to trumpets, and Beit is house, so this reads for the house, or indicating the house of trumpeting. As Sabbath would approach on a Friday evening, it was important for the residents in the area to be aware when the Sabbath began so that they would respectfully refrain from any labor. Similarly, when the Sabbath closed, they would want to know when it was finished and they could once again resume exertions and labor. So the way the priestly community provided that information was to have a trumpeter far up on the wall sound the notes of his instrument, announcing either the onset or the conclusion of the Sabbath. I suppose that would have been a place to announce festivals or other calendrical events as well. This stone used to be far up at the top, but it was either accidentally removed or forcibly removed. Some of the destruction that we're going to be reinforcing or portraying, we know took place around 70 AD at the destruction of the temple. It's possible that the Roman legion troops, we know that they pillaged the town and the temple and burned. It's possible that they may have dislodged that significant piece of stonework far up, causing it to fall down to where it was excavated by archaeologists centuries later. To get another picture of this same site, it's helpful to take a look at this model. The cyan circle shows where that bore was in the corner. Here's that southwest corner. And the small parallelogram there underneath the arch indicates where the pavement was damaged and undulating. The trumpeter's corner is shown by the yellow angle there at the top of the wall. It fell down, damaging the pavement below. Also, we want to be aware of this structure no longer visible, but archaeologists have been able to reconstruct what would have been there in model or in drawing form. It's known as Wilson's Arch. That arch also was destroyed, and it would be responsible for some of the undulation of the pavement below. Here's that same corner seen from a different view, and we're interested now in the protrusion that comes from the wall. This is the remainder of the base, the right-hand base of Wilson's Arch. Here you can see it a little more clearly. These would have been enormous, enormous stones forming this arch, and when it was destroyed, the impact would have caused the denting of the pavement below. Come again to Isaiah's simile, where he describes this break in the high wall, bulging out, collapsing, crashing down, just as we saw happen hundreds of years later in the case of structures around the Jerusalem temple. Our intent here is not to suggest that Isaiah 30 is predictive prophecy for the destruction of Jerusalem, simply drawing on a later destruction of stonework to appreciate what was intended by Isaiah's simile. A structure that should bring great security, when it falls apart, can bring great devastation, and that is his word picture for the danger of embracing iniquity knowingly and not letting go of it. Now we'll turn our attention to Isaiah's second simile in these brief 2 verses. A fragment of a potter's vessel, smashed so ruthlessly that among its fragments not a shirt is found for taking fire from the hearth or dipping water out of the cistern. We'll want to move over to Caesarea Maritime in order to appreciate the next example, an example of pottery that has been smashed. Now let's move from Jerusalem and the old wall of Hezekiah, making our way instead out to the coast towards Caesarea Maritime. Here we'll be looking first of all at a beautiful amphitheater that was built by Herod the Great just a little bit before the time of Christ. And then we'll take a look at some excavation in a hippodrome. Here we have come out to the coast, and we're located looking over Caesarea Maritime. That's distinguishing it from Caesarea Philippi. Here we have the equivalent view of Caesarea Maritime, only using Google Earth. And this will let us zero in to view a little more closely. First of all, the amphitheater that you see here. And in a moment you'll see a photo taken from about this point, viewed in this direction. And then a little bit later we'll walk through this direction and view part of the wall in the hippodrome, roughly in this territory. Now admittedly, these are much, much later than Isaiah's time, but I think by the time we view the excavation of this particular wall, you'll see the point, and it will illuminate one of the similes that is so powerful in Isaiah's prophecy. Here we are in the great theater built by Herod the Great, 1st century BC, in Caesarea Maritime. Off to our left is the Mediterranean Sea. And now we've moved over to the place where horse races were celebrated. This was a very popular sport. In fact, they built an enormous hippodrome, a large racing oval. As fascinating as it's the hippodrome itself, for our purposes right now, we're interested in the fill mound, this reddish-brown sediment that still remains. Initially, this entire area was filled with this reddish-brown, these fragments. Here you can see our tour guide and the layers of the fill. I wonder if you can tell what we're looking at here. Next, let's close in on the orange shaded rectangle. Can you see that these are small pieces of pottery? This was, in essence, a garbage dump for Caesarea. When they quit enjoying the horse races, they just began to throw their refuse. Imagine taking broken glass, broken jars, broken corralware, or some other sort of porcelain from your own kitchen. And once it's smashed, it's useless. You want to get it out of the way. As we wrap up this study on literary devices, in particular Isaiah's use of similes, let's go back to the passage and see what kind of message he was sending. In the portion that I didn't display earlier, we can see that he is indicting several actions on the part of his audience. They've been saying, don't prophesy. So, prophet, we don't want to know what you're condemning us for. Let us no more hear about this Holy One of Israel. Don't talk to us about God. Instead, in verse 12, they are putting their trust in oppression and deceit. They are saying, we will be secure, we will get ahead if we use a sense of toughness and cleverness, shading the truth. That is the iniquity which will become for them a high wall. They're putting their trust in it, but it will come crashing down. They cannot hide behind it. In fact, it'll crash down to such small splinters that it will be like potsherds. You can't hide behind a potsherd and expect it to intercept some enemy's rock or arrow. What they have trusted in, namely oppression, deceit, and rejecting God's message, will be for them a defense that is worth nothing at all. Let's return to the excavation site in Jerusalem of Hezekiah's secondary wall in order to examine another aspect of the defenses that he set up. Notice the type that's highlighted in blue. You collected the waters of the lower pool. You made a reservoir between the two walls for the water of the old pool. This is referring to a defensive engineering investment which Hezekiah made, anticipating that Jerusalem would be put under a siege. 2 Kings 20 records this same event. Now the rest of the deeds of Hezekiah and all his power, how he made the pool and the conduit and brought water into the city, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Judah? This is a major engineering feat, and we'll take a look at a bit of it in the next few pictures. For orientation, back to the map that shows us where the temple is located, the temple site, the Temple Mount, and then Hezekiah's new wall, where we were standing with the photograph a moment ago. Direct your attention now to the cyan oval in the upper right. The star is located over Gihon Spring, the source of water. The squiggly blue line indicates the pathway of the water, part of which represents a major tunneling effort in the 8th century as Hezekiah commissioned the enlargement of what was previously just a fissure, a careful enlargement with a slow flow of water which would bring it inside the city walls, accessible by people who were under siege. This is what it looks like when you're beginning the descent down to the water level on the upstream end. Notice this stone. This is solid rock that they had to tunnel through. Other ancient historians describe this as a process of just taking iron implements and chiseling away at the rock. Once you're down to the water level, it looks like this. Notice how clear the water is. It's a narrow passageway. Just how narrow you can see now as we have a couple of fellow travelers. The one in back is bracing himself. Your head wouldn't normally be up to the top, although the ceiling level does vary. Sometimes it's quite high, even higher than this, other times a bit lower. Much of the tunnel is approximately as wide as is shown here, about shoulder width. Sometimes it'll broaden out a bit. You can see in this portion the water level is almost up to the waist. This walk through the tunnel was in March. Depending on the season, it can be higher, even chest high or lower. The water is just crystal clear and cool. Very, very beautiful. Notice the patchwork on the walls. What they seem to have done is plastered the wall, and this was not unusual for cisterns, any water catchment basins. And here you see some lines indicating staining, evidently from water going through, and then areas where the plaster has fallen away. Hezekiah's tunnel exits at the pool of Siloam. Now notice the close of this passage from Isaiah 22. You made these defensive preparations, but, and here's the indictment, you did not look to him who did it, or have regard for him who planned it long ago. It's evidently this engineering feat that Isaiah is describing. The problem is that despite these heroic efforts of a human engineering sort, he's saying there was not sufficient trust in God, who was the ultimate fortifier, the founder and the defense of the entire nation. This concludes our survey of just a small sampling of literary devices employed by Isaiah. I hope you come away with an appreciation that although a device may be relatively small and brief, the impact of it may be great, particularly if we can immerse ourselves in the world of the writer. Also, we've taken a bit of a detour to take a look at the water engineering project, although that did not refer to a literary device as such. It was a great opportunity for us to get in touch with some of the history of Isaiah's era, history that shows up in his prophecy, history that was strategic for Hezekiah, for the population of Jerusalem, particularly in the face of the attack and siege of Sennacherib in 701. Now we'll move our attention to a theological exploration of major themes in Isaiah.